Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is the Energy Storage Interconnection Bottleneck. This webinar is being presented by the DOE OE Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, also known as STAP. STAP is a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. Before I pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar and our exciting panel of speakers, I'd like to go over some very quick webinar logistics. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via computer, mic, and speakers, or you can connect via telephone. If you would like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled. You can also click on that orange arrow to expand your webinar console. And one of the things that you may like to do with your webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments. We will be saving some time at the very end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. We'll get to as many questions as we can. We have a lot of people registered today, so we should get a lot of questions. Do type yours in when you think of them to give yourself a better chance of getting that question answered. Finally, we are recording this webinar, and we will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the webinar slides, and that'll be out probably within a day or two. We will also post all of those webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I am pleased to pass it over now to my colleague, Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a Senior Project Director at Clean Energy Group and the Clean Energy States Alliance.
Thanks, Samantha. Hi, everyone. I'm Todd. I'm waving because we have so many people on this webinar that it may take you a while to figure out which one of us is speaking. So welcome. This is another in our long-running STAP webinar series. STAP I will introduce in a moment. First of all, I wanted to introduce the Clean Energy States Alliance in case you are unfamiliar. CESA is a nonprofit. We are located in Vermont. Our sister/parent organization, Clean Energy Group, is also a nonprofit, also located in Vermont. CESA is essentially a membership organization for state energy agencies. You can see the logos of our members here on the slide. We help them with all kinds of clean energy program and policy development, analysis, research, knowledge sharing related to their work. And when we say clean energy, it encompasses anything from solar to onshore wind, offshore wind, energy storage, biomass, so a variety of technologies. We also focus quite a bit on equity and trying to make sure that these clean energy technologies are made available to all. And we work down past the state level as well, sometimes with municipalities and communities. If you could advance the slide, please, Samantha. The Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, or STAP, is a long-running program we conduct under a contract to Sandia National Laboratories. It's funded by US DOE Office of Electricity. Primary activities of STAP are, for one thing, we try to promote energy storage broadly through disseminating information to stakeholders, and this webinar is a prime example of that. We try to set up and help develop and install and run energy storage demonstration projects, and we're going to hear today from Tony Sparks from Albuquerque Public Schools, one of our recent project locations, about his experience. And then we also work to support state energy storage policy efforts and program development efforts across the country. And you can see this map is quite out of date, actually. I'm realizing I need to really update it, but it gives you a sense of some of the things we are doing across the country. Next slide, please. Before I go on, I do want to thank Dr. Imre Zsuk of Energy Storage, Director of Energy Storage Research at US DOE Office of Electricity, and Waylon Clark, Energy Storage Program Demonstration Team Lead from Sandia National Laboratories, for all of their support. Next slide, please. So we are going to hear, as I said, from quite a few speakers today. We are going to do our best to make this entertaining as well as educational, keep it from dragging and getting dry, and certainly we're going to attempt to leave room for your questions and discussion topics at the end. Do please type in your questions and comments as you think of them. That makes it easier for me to sort through them and make sure that we've got a good selection of them ready to go at the end. Also, if you have a clarifying question on something somebody said that maybe you didn't understand, go ahead and type that in. We may take a few of those as we go along. We're going to hear today from Chirag, Lala from Applied Economics Clinic, and Sachin, Peddada, also from Applied Economics Clinic. I'll introduce their work in just a minute. We'll hear from Kirk Shields from Green Mountain Power, the largest utility in our state of Vermont, and a partner in several energy storage projects. We will hear from Schuyler Matteson of NYSERDA, that's the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. We'll hear from Tony Sparks of Albuquerque Public Schools, and I already mentioned that we have worked with Tony recently, along with Sandia and DOE, on a large battery project there. And I am the moderator, and so I will be moderating in addition to this brief introduction. Next slide, please. The opening, well, I think we missed one. I had another slide in there. Okay, well, I guess we dropped a slide somehow, but I will just say that the opening presentation, oh, there it is. The opening presentation here, that's okay, is from the Applied Economics Clinic. Clean Energy Group contracted with them to research and write this report, which just came out. It's about a week old now, this report, or a week and a half. It's available for download at the URL you can see at the bottom of the screen there. If you download the slides later, you can get that URL that way as well. And the report, I think, is really focusing attention on several key issues that are keeping energy storage projects, good projects, from being built. And all of this, of course, has to do with interconnection and the barriers to storage and other distributed clean energy resources. And it has to do with the fact that interconnection processes, like many other processes and regulations, are old, and they've been around for a while, and they need to be updated to really accommodate this new energy storage technology. So with that, I will pass the baton to Chirag, Lala from Applied Economics Clinic.
Thank you so much, Todd, and hello everyone. It's good to meet you. My name is Chirag Lala. I'm a researcher at the Applied Economics Clinic. We're a small nonprofit consulting firm that does technical work on matters of energy, the environment, economics, and equity for a variety of public service organizations. We did this report in partnership with the Clean Energy Group, and I'm very, very proud to be here to present it today. So let's get started. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about what this report was. We wanted to put out something that would describe interconnection processes both in Massachusetts and nationally, with a focus on the state level interconnection process in Massachusetts, kind of as the main focus of our report, because we wanted to get to the bottom of, one, what are the main barriers to speedy interconnection, right? Is it just a matter of administrative process, something taking too long, or are there other issues within how we conduct interconnection of solar and storage resources that might be causing some troubles? And then we wanted to both lay out potential solutions to those barriers in a way that would then help readers assess subsequent resources that they then came across on the topic, right? And also to sift through the kinds of solutions that are out there and think about why, you know, some might work better than others in tackling the problem. Next slide, please. Now, as part of this work, we conducted both primary research and interviews with a variety of stakeholders, some of whom had worked as policymakers, some of whom had worked on developers or development teams, some of whom had worked with utilities before. And so this work very much encompasses contributions from those interviewees, though I should stress that it should not be taken to represent the views of any of their organizations specifically. Next slide, please. So I want to start this presentation by actually going through this interconnection process in Massachusetts. And so let me first say that this is the interconnection process in Massachusetts specifically for projects going through Massachusetts utilities, the process that is regulated by the Massachusetts government. It does not encompass projects that may go through ISO New England's processes or FERC processes elsewhere, and certainly not those of other regions, although it is very, very similar to how some of those processes are structured. Number one, this process sees both standardized, expedited, and simplified processes, whereby you skip certain steps if your project meets certain thresholds. But for most projects, the presumption is that if you go through all of the steps, you will encounter at some point a system impact study. That's step 3. In this process. And the reason a solar or storage project might go through that is because it's not as simple as just plugging it into the grid, turning the project on and saying go, right? The grid has to be able to handle, in this case, the distribution grid has to be able to handle the potential for power to flow both ways, right? Storage projects especially both charge from the grid and they release power onto the grid, they discharge onto the grid. And that takes certain kinds of what are called hosting capacity upgrades to the local distribution system in order to be able to handle a new storage project. Otherwise, you won't be able to interconnect it to the grid, or there may be issues with power reliability in the area, for instance. And so you go through this process in order to assess what those changes might be. And then once they are agreed to, the project in question is then supposed to pay for the upgrades that are determined by this process under the principle of cost causation, which argues that since the project created the need for these upgrades, the project itself should pay. It then goes on to installation and interconnection. I will come back to this question of hosting capacity upgrades and system impact studies again and again, because it is the structure of those studies and how they are conducted that impacts why we have so many bottlenecks, why we have an interconnection queue of the size that we do, why costs are growing. And so you will see me reference this process over and over. Next slide, please. Now, I wanted to paint a little bit of a picture of what's been going on in Massachusetts, and one, we can see that over time, proposed solar and storage projects in Massachusetts have been growing. There was a particularly large spike a couple of years ago in proposed solar projects, but you'll notice that authorized solar and storage projects, this is measured in terms of their capacity, have not grown that much. And so over time, the queue, the projects that are waiting to interconnect, has been growing. Next slide, please. You can also see this in the number of incomplete and withdrawn applications for interconnection and versus the number of complete applications. I don't want to make too much hay of that steep drop off at the end, because some of that is just new projects coming in. That kind of that data divergence at the end will correct itself as more time passes from 2022. But we can say that for the most part, incomplete and withdrawn applications, or at least the number of them, have outpaced the number of complete applications. Next slide, please. And this is a picture of the Massachusetts interconnection queue. It is quite large. It is mostly solar, hybrid, and storage projects. And it represents, and this is a very rough figure calculation that we did, but roughly $8 billion of planned investments in Massachusetts, or about 1.2% of Massachusetts's economic activity. And a couple things should stand out in addition to the fact that this is dominated by solar, hybrid, and storage projects. By themselves, each of these components are larger than the respective, for example, solar capacity in Massachusetts. So this is quite a large queue that has built up over time, and it's just based on data that is published openly by Massachusetts DOER. Next slide, please. I also wanted to give you a brief picture at transmission level interconnection queues in the various ISO and RTO regions, and you'll notice that they themselves, for the most part, have also been growing, and that growth over time has been dominated by solar, wind, standalone storage, and hybrid storage over time. So this isn't just a Massachusetts specific issue. Next slide, please. And this is a look at the national queues, again, over those same regions. And here we actually are able to compare the entirety of American installed capacity versus what has been in the queue, and a couple of things should stand out. Number one, installed capacity was larger than the queue in 2010, although the queue was still dominated by wind and solar, wind especially. Now, 12 years on, or 13 years on now, we have to update this for 2023, the queue is both larger than what is installed in the United States, but it's also dominated by more than just wind. You have storage, hybrid storage resources, solar in there. And this queue is also an indication of the subtitle of our report, which is a lot of these projects, because of the structure of the interconnection process, will likely not get built, or at least if they don't get built, they won't get built for a very, very long time. Next slide, please. So I want to now talk about why. We, across our various interviews, our reading of the literature, we did come up with basic categorizations of reasons why some of these projects won't get built. And the first of these is cost causation. I mentioned this earlier, but cost causation is the idea that if you propose a project and the process results in the interconnection process saying you have to make X, Y, and Z upgrades to hosting capacity in order to interconnect, that you as the project applicant should bear the costs because your project is the reason upgrades are even necessary. This creates a couple problems. One, it means that those who are responsible for managing the distribution grid don't have a financial incentive to actually invest in hosting capacity more regularly. I mean, as an example, distribution utilities usually cannot claim ratepayer funds for hosting capacity upgrades in the way that they might be able to for load changes, or changes to answer load rather. And another thing is it also creates an incentive then to jockey in the queue, or at least to negotiate quite a bit over what those upgrades will be. If you are in the queue, it actually matters whether you are first, second, third, fourth, or fifth, etc. in the queue, because if somebody in front of you happens to make upgrades that are useful to your project, you will never be responsible for paying for them. Vice versa, if you happen to make upgrades that are a little bit more than your project needs, somebody else will benefit from the extra hosting capacity that is added, right? For the utilities, it may create an incentive to be extra cautious in terms of the system impact modeling that they do in order to determine hosting capacity upgrades, right? And if they're extra cautious and demand more upgrades of every single project, that will also raise interconnection costs. And studies at this point, particularly a set of studies from the Berkeley laboratory, have argued that this kind of cost acceleration from the system impact modeling is responsible for a large percent of the increase in average interconnection costs. Next slide, please. It also creates a situation where nobody is planning ahead of time for distribution level hosting capacity upgrades. There is not an entity in Massachusetts, and certainly not in other states, that is able to say, we anticipate this much distributed energy resources will interconnect. We want to prepare for this much solar, this much storage, this much hybrid, and we should make these upgrades in advance. That doesn't happen. Upgrades are determined and costed at the time of an application, which means that if you were able to chart hosting capacity kind of over time, it would be a very stepwise, slow increase over time, rather than, say, outpacing or keeping up with intended hosting capacity upgrades. And this is also what creates bottlenecks, because it makes these system impact studies more complicated, because nobody is tasked with making those upgrades again ahead of time. Next slide, please. And I'd like you all to take a moment and think about this from the perspective of an interconnection application, whether it is an individual standalone application or it is part of a group of projects all applying together. Whether that project is privately financed via, just conventional loan finance or by bond issues or whatever else, or whether it's financed by a mixture of grants and, municipal aid money, projects only anticipate a certain amount of interconnection costs. If those costs exceed a certain point, that project may not be viable, or certain sources of financing may just disappear if the study takes too long. And this is true of projects that are financed by loans, or it's true of projects that are financed by grants. We know of examples where a school or hospital had access to certain money that then disappeared because they weren't able to get through the interconnection process in time, right? And again, these costs are very much driven by that jockeying and negotiation over interconnection costs and the lack of anticipatory planning for them. Next slide, please. I also want to highlight a couple of storage-specific barriers. Now, others will get into this in more detail, but storage projects have it especially tough because their charging and discharging, from at least the perspective of the utility, can be quite unpredictable without certain assurances. And so you'll find with a lot of interconnection processes that they either don't define storage very well, or they insist on treating storage in the modeling as operating at the most extreme use cases. An example of this is saying, a modeling process might say, we want to model storage as if it will charge at peak times when everybody else is coming home and using electricity, even if the project applicants say we never would intend to charge storage around peak times, we would want to discharge around then. Sometimes storage processes will still be modeled that way. And so, interconnection processes just generally don't account for either the technologies or logistical processes that might help in preventing that kind of thing. Next slide, please. So I want to wrap up by just going through a couple of recommendations that we identified based on this assessment of barriers. And the first of these is to actually do some sort of anticipatory integrated system-wide planning where somebody, whether it is the utility or a state working group or a state agency, looks at the system and says, we anticipate needing this much hosting capacity in these areas over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And then actually planning to make those investments ahead of time, right? And we note that this would require some process, but it would also require an institution that is capable of intervening over time in that process and coordinating the stakeholders of the grid in order to bypass issues that may come up or if facts on the ground change relative to earlier planning periods. Next slide, please. The second thing is to think about reforming cost allocation so that you incorporate more stakeholders than just the project or the cluster applying for interconnection. I say project and or cluster because sometimes projects will try and go through interconnection together as a group, but that creates issues as well, right? The determination of hosting capacity still has to wait for a group to apply. And if the group can't figure out how to allocate costs among themselves, then they're in real deep trouble. And then worse, if somebody leaves the group partway through the interconnection process, which can and does happen, then you may have to start the entire process all over again, right? And among the discussions that might happen do include, should ratepayers be involved in facilitating interconnection, in an advanced fashion because they might be one of the parties that are benefiting. It is a discussion, and we do talk about it a little in the paper. Next slide, please. Finally, and again, I won't get into these in too much detail. Some of these will be mentioned later on in this webinar, but we do push that storage resources be treated as much as possible based on how they will actually operate or function in practice. And there are a variety of technologies available today that processes could do better to incorporate, smart inverters and the like, that could help regulate when storage resources charge and discharge. There are logistical innovations or administrative innovations like the use of operating profiles that may or may not work to facilitate this. And there's an excellent report that IREC helped coordinate called the Batteries Report, which we draw upon heavily, that discusses some of these storage specific solutions as well. Next slide, please. All right. So that is everything from us. It's very much a kind of overall guide to the interconnection process and some of the potential solutions. We do hope to continue research on this in future and potentially look into specific solutions in more detail and assess them a little bit. But in the meantime, this is my contact information and that of my colleague, as well as a report link, and I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chirag. That was a great summary of the report. While we're setting up for our next speaker, who is going to be Tony Sparks from Albuquerque, I just want to clarify one thing. We started off talking about Massachusetts, and the reason is that we happen to have some funding. We do a lot of work on energy storage in Massachusetts. We have partners there. Applied Economics Clinic is located there. And so it makes it a good place for us to kind of use as a case study for topics like this. But that does not mean that the conclusions of the report are specific to one state. They are not. These kinds of issues with extremely high costs for interconnection, for energy storage. I saw something nationally that if you're interconnecting a new natural gas resource, it costs $24 per kilowatt average, and a new energy storage resource interconnection costs on average over $230 per kilowatt nationally. The only thing more expensive than storage is offshore wind. And that kind of makes sense because to interconnect offshore wind, you're laying a bunch of undersea cable, but that's not the case for storage. So these are national problems. They're problems that have to do with the exact same procedures, cost causation, one at a time, taking the projects in the queue as they arise one at a time, rather than looking holistically at the distribution grid or even the transmission grid and making needed upgrades proactively, and storage not being considered in all of these processes as its own technology with its own operational characteristics. Those are all common across the United States. So I just wanted to clarify that. We are going to hear now from Tony Sparks from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he's going to tell us about his experiences with an energy storage project that is, as I understand it, still in process.
Unbelievably, as we'll talk about. Thank you, Todd. My name is Tony Sparks. I work for the largest school district in New Mexico that actually has a pretty embedded culture and commitment to sustainability. I am the energy manager for the district, as well as the project manager for HVAC and energy related projects. That's how I ended up on this one. And you're going to get a case study that verifies what both Chirag and Todd have just said. It does span states and makes a difference. So you're going to hear about a particular project at our largest school. This is Trisco Heritage Academy High School. You can see this campus is basically a small city, large footprint, lots of buildings, and it had huge utility bills. The summertime bills were over $50,000 a month, and over half of that was demand charges. So we created a project, a concept to put a battery storage system in there for peak shaving. The typical thing that battery storage would do, would charge at night, basically during off-peak hours, and deploy energy during the day when it was needed to avoid peak. We had 500 kilowatts built into our base utility rate, so we wanted to reduce the peak below 500 all times if possible. In our case, we have 160 school sites, 13 high schools. We thought this would also be a test case for possible replication elsewhere in the district, but we started with the one that was the highest utility. The other possibility that this created was a potential for resiliency during a power emergency, which we explored later. We ended up choosing the Tesla Megapack as the battery, and that was at the time the largest Tesla installation in the state. And this beautiful installation on the side of the school is waiting to be turned on, and it's been there quite a while. We'll get into that in a minute. So part of the consideration when we looked at the finances of it was, does it pay for itself? And our contractor helped us realize if we put solar with it, we could definitely reduce the payback. So the 850 kilowatts is about 2.5 times larger than any other solar installation we have in the district. We have almost 30 solar installations on schools. And the payback for the battery by itself was approximately 17 years, and I've got an asterisk there. With the PV added on top of the battery, it reduced it to under 13 years. And that's total cost versus savings. It does not include the grant monies that we received that I'll talk about in a bit. So the asterisk in the without PV is important for this discussion, because the savings on this peak shaving battery system were entirely dependent on the utility rate structure. In other words, we were doing it for financial reasons to reduce a peak demand and the charges associated with it. But if the rate class changes and the criteria for when you get charged change, which is doing quickly with more distributed energy on the grid, then that changes the payback drastically. When you add battery and solar together, suddenly you can use anything anytime you want. So these are all the roofs that got solar put on them. An interesting thing for the utility is that we interconnected each of these into the building that it was located on. So there's a utility production meter on each building, not just one on the site. And that presents particular challenges for the utility for other reasons. The battery, which is not connected to the solar directly, but is connected to a high voltage loop around the campus, is on a separate meter as well. And it just made it, I should mention that our campuses are closed for security reasons. So access to buildings and meters is a challenge for the utility and for us. So regardless, this project was very important for the community, for the state, and even for DOE. We are a high-profile demonstration project trying to show whether a school can deploy this type of technology effectively and cost-effectively for wide rollout throughout the country. So by involving all these partners, we had wide support and a lot of different perspectives about how things could be done. A lot of people to look at the data and examine exactly how effective it is. Sharing the financial burden, we got grants through the Department of Energy and our state energy office. And in this case, it's an R&D project, but it's a functional R&D project that stays in use and benefits the school as it goes. Here's where it gets fun. We wanted to do interconnection, and I'm going to trip through we call it the approval timeline for what our experience was. And what you're going to get from me now is what it feels like to be a project with a lot of energy and support and enthusiasm and hope, and what it feels like because of the interconnection agreement. So our initial application went in September of 2021. And a lot of conversations went back and forth, questions about what we should do, some requests for corrections to address things such as Chirag mentioned for protection and insurance of the grid. Our frustration about that was that it was a linear process, that every time we were asked for a correction or a change, we made it, we put it back in, we started back in the queue and went through the whole process again. And it was like a different person looking at it each time along the way. So we made a special request when we first applied. We wanted a separate interconnection agreement for the battery from the solar because of when they would be deployed. The solar went up first actually before the battery was available, and we could have used that, but the utility was interested in having them combined because they would both impact the grid in the same place. So starting in 2021 and continuing into 2022, we ended up with bi-weekly status meetings with the interconnection group at our utility. That's how crazy it was. And we would go back and forth, all the stakeholders in there. The initial review only was actually passed on October 17th of 2022, more than a year later. And that was the initial review. That then triggered supplemental reviews, a whole host of them, I didn't know there were so many supplemental reviews available, technical and grid risk and I don't know, modification or all. They had a lot of names for them, but each time they would start a new one, they'd say, okay, it's going to take at least another 30 or 60 business days for this particular one. So that started in November of 2022. And I have to say that we felt like we were getting a bit of the runaround. And here's kind of our expression at this point. We've been going through this for more than a year, and we're not even close to the finish line. So as it continues, I got with our account manager for the utility and asked for his assistance to work with the people he knows over there. It felt like there were so many departments at the utility all doing their own thing and no one was talking to each other. So our account manager was willing to jump in and trying to expedite things. And this resulted in an in-person meeting with our utility department managers. There were 11 of them representing 6 or 7 departments at the utility for a sit-down face-to-face meeting with APS. That occurred just last month, April 6th. And it was a wonderful meeting where we talked about everything. We talked about solar interconnection, battery interconnection, microgrids, electric vehicle rate changes. And there were a lot of things expressed on both sides about what the challenges were and what it felt like, and a lot of promises made. About 3 weeks later, we got our conditional approval for the installation of the battery and storage with solar. However, it was conditioned on the upgrades that both Todd and Chirag were talking about. Some were taken on by the utility itself to pay for, and a large chunk was also made on our dime to pay for the upgrades required because we triggered it. So that was an unexpected expense, and it came, a year and a half after we started. But then we learned that these upgrades, due to typical supply chain and labor issues that are out there, would be at least 20 weeks before they could even be installed once we get a PO to make them happen. So that added to our timeline unexpectedly there. So in the end, the consequences to this were financial. To have a solar array of 850 kilowatts and a battery system out there in place for a year or more and not able to turn on meant we were losing all the benefits that we had anticipated by doing the project. And this little jewel came up. The Tesla people were monitoring the battery, and we got notified that it had lost energy to a critical level because of inactivity. Over time, it just kind of dissipated some of the storage that it's chipped with. And if we didn't go and charge it immediately, we would risk damaging the battery. But it was not approved for charging from the grid, so we had to rent a generator and go and charge the battery so we could get through the interconnection process, which we're still waiting for another 20 weeks or so. So you got to see what that feels like. That's major aggravation. So I want you to know that there is some cooperation between APS and the utility that's pretty substantial. And even the owner for our contractor is very involved with the interconnection process. He is on the committee with the Public Regulation Commission to figure out the next phase of what interconnection needs to look like. He's on the front line of the energy transition efforts for the state. And that's the contractor that's building our project. So he has influence and insight about how this all works. So here's what I learned. And you're going to hear a lot more about this with the next speaker, but these are some of the challenges the utility has. Acceptance and integration, because that technology is new and there's lots of unknowns. So it was clear to us that the utility wasn't certain what to ask us to do, and they didn't know what the impacts might be based on the particulars of this large solar and crazy battery sitting out there interacting, doing things at different times. So an unknown. They're facing, just like any of us, workload and manpower issues. The exponential growth for renewable energy and distributed energy and storage by itself has had an overwhelming effect on their interconnection capabilities, but they even have difficulty with hiring people to do meter readings. We're having to have alternate means for our utility to read the local meters in order to get everything done, because they can't find people, can't hire people to do all the jobs. So that definitely affects the timeline of how things get done. Fewer people to do it. As was mentioned, the infrastructure is outdated and not prepared for the kind of things that we're adding to the grid right now. Those upgrades are very expensive, and there do need to be cost sharings to make it happen. In our case, the policies are lacking, and I think Todd mentioned this. The regulated utilities, which we're under, must abide by statutes, and statutes take a long time to approve, and they take a lot of people putting input in, and you can't be as nimble as you might like because the policies for how to do things don't exist yet. And finally, is distributed energy actually a threat to grid stability and their profits? Are the utilities even willing or eager to participate in this kind of progress when it might threaten their bottom line? But I will leave you by saying that in the end, the challenges of this project on the interconnection side greatly discourage development of this kind of projects. And if we didn't have so much tenacity and enthusiasm about making it done and so many people involved in securing that it does happen, I don't think we would have remained in there.
Thanks, Tony. That was fascinating. I'm just, before we go to the next speaker, do you, and I didn't ask you this ahead of time, so I'm catching you completely off guard here. It just occurred to me to ask, do you have any, have you done any kind of rough calculation, or do you have any kind of estimate of what this has cost in terms of delays in getting the project up and running? Because, you know, you did mention some things. I mean, you had to rent a generator to charge the battery because you weren't cleared yet to charge it from the grid, and obviously you're foregoing some savings, energy cost savings that you could have realized had you been able to start the thing up when you expected. And all of these projects, of course, you know, generally come with some kind of financing, and people have to sometimes start paying back on that financing, and that may happen before the thing is up and running. So I'm just curious. I don't know if any of what applies to your particular project, but, you know, what's the cost of the delays?
Yeah, I will look at it just with the anticipated savings from the battery and the solar in general terms. And so probably a couple $100,000 per year in expected savings just from that, that we didn't get. So in addition to the cost that we're bearing for infrastructure upgrades, and then, you know, things like the generator, which was minimal, but there, and equipment changes during the first year of discussions about putting certain type of switch gear in or whatever, smart equipment that could prevent feeding back onto the grid. So, yeah, much more than that.
Right, and you're still waiting to be able. You still are not able to actually use the thing, right? So that 20 weeks is it's like an estimate looking ahead, but you don't really know.
We don't, and we just got the POs in place to do the infrastructure upgrades, and then so that starts the clock on the 20 weeks, which was an estimate anyway. Thanks.
All right. Well, I wanted to remind folks to please type the questions in as we go along. We will now go to our next speaker, Kirk Shields from Green Mountain Power. Green Mountain Power is one of the unusual forward-looking utilities that has embraced energy storage. There are utilities out there that have been sort of, what's a nice way to say this, kind of digging their heels in and trying to slow down some of the transitions to clean energy. Green Mountain Power has really become a leader in storage. So I'm going to be very interested to hear what Kirk has to say about their perspectives on the interconnection issues that have been raised. So I'll pass it over to Kirk.
Thanks a lot, Todd. I appreciate it. I'm Kirk Shields with Green Mountain Power, or GMP. And my role with GMP is to lead renewable project development, such as solar, battery storage, wind, and also lead the electrification of our transportation fleet. So pretty busy time. I'm really happy to be here with everybody today to talk about the utility perspective of interconnection. It's a painful process on both the developer side and on the utility side. So we feel the pain as well as developers do, because we also act as a developer in the development role for utility scale projects as well. So we get in the queue just like everybody else. So it really is important for us to help not only customers and developers manage the interconnection process, but it also helps us as a utility company as well to be able to manage that process effectively. So just very quickly, a little about GMP. We're a very small utility in Vermont. We serve about 80% of Vermont. We have a very rural service territory, so there's a lot of challenges in serving highly rural areas. So we're big into solar, we're big into storage, we're dipping our toes into microgrids. And even though we're small, we feel like we're a real progressive company, as Todd mentioned. So we've gotten some nominations for some awards, but it just kind of reflects some of our overall thinking about how to work with customers and think about the electric industry as a whole and how it's evolving. So the next few slides are pretty much old news, but just to give a flavor, net metering really started to evolve really rapidly about 10 years ago. So in Vermont especially, even though we're small and mountainous, solar really gained a lot of traction. Net metering started back in 2001, and then it saw different flavors of net metering. We saw the addition of a feed-in tariff and different flavors of that. So, through the last 10 years or so, net metering in Vermont, in New England, and across the country has really gained a lot of traction. So, one of the other slides you saw that our peak load in Vermont is about 650 to 700 megawatts, and this slide shows what the solar install capacity in our own service area right now is. And this is almost 2 years old now, but you can see the magnitude it's approaching half of our peak load. So it's a pretty crazy amount that's been developed just in a very short period of time. So as you can imagine, each one of those projects had to go into the interconnection queue, get out the other side, and become a real project. So it's a lot to manage. And this is also representative of how fast interconnection requests have grown. So both on the small, the medium, and the large size of different renewable projects, it's a lot. It was a lot to manage, and it continues. It peaked, and it's declining a little bit every year, but the volume of interconnection requests is still going really strong. So back when net metering first started and solar started to get really cheap, we made a conscious decision as an electric utility that we wanted to help customers achieve their goals and be where they wanted to be. So rather than be an impediment to developers and customers in achieving their goals, we wanted to be a partner. We knew that when we did that it was going to reduce retail sales, and it definitely has. But our philosophy at the time, and still is that we will figure out the business side of it, but most importantly, we want to help customers get to where they want it to be. Unfortunately, the process of helping customers get to where they want to be is, in the developer side, it was really tough for developers to site projects, especially for feed-in tariff or group net metering projects that were larger than rooftop. Some of the ground mount installations, 50 kW to 500 kW. Developers had a tough time trying to figure out where these should go and where it was most efficient to site these electrically. So you can put them on any open piece of land, but electrically, there's some real cost implications, some real operational implications to where you site these projects. So it makes a big difference to developers that they make good, efficient use of their time, and the resources and keeping the costs down for interconnection. So what we wanted to do was to help the development community with some online tools for making good siting decisions. It didn't necessarily help with the application process once an interconnection application came in, but it really helped developers figure out where the best sites were going to be, so that downstream we ran into fewer traps about upgrades or just not making it feasible at all. So a couple of things that we offered to developers. One was we created a solar map using our GIS system, and we were able to color code all the areas of our distribution grid and show approximately in red areas where it was going to be very difficult or expensive to interconnect certain sized projects. And then where it's green is you have a higher success of being able to achieve interconnection. So one of the primary filters in doing this kind of desktop review was seeing what kind of substation capacity was left for the substation transformers there. So that was a big tell, and it also kind of spoke to some of the transmission constraints. So this was, you can zero into this map value with an address and see the color application of how easy it might be to interconnect a project to the distribution grid. So another tool that we offered was the distribution map. So this was a secondary desktop review, sort of a screening tool. Once you decided you're in an area that it looked, promising, that it wasn't a red area, now you can look at things like wire sizes, whether there's fiber there or not, where are the reclosers, that sort of thing, to be able to try to drill in, another step deeper into whether you're going to get into reconductoring or other types of upgrades that might be needed to be able to interconnect. And then lastly, we had a three-phase map. So it's just another tool. Some of these tools overlap in their capabilities a little bit, but for a larger project, certainly you need three-phase to interconnect. So this was another map that you could get into an address, and it would show the feeder that you were trying to connect to, what kind of operating voltage, what kind of wire you're looking at, and see that if you've got single phase or three phase and how far three phase service might be there. So at least you can identify if you do need three phase and you're 3 miles away, you've only got single phase there, you can identify that early on and try to either fail your development early or turn to another site. So developers were really using these as desktop tools to be able to go, before they even approached the utility, they were able to go through and see whether an area had some promise or not, and try to make best use of the time that they had to develop projects quickly. And GMP, as a project developer ourselves, we use these tools as well for the same exercises when we're looking at large utility scale solar, either in battery storage, either paired together or separately. So it's been a good set of tools to use. The development community has received them well, and it's not the cure-all for every problem, but it certainly has helped smooth out the upfront communication portion of the whole interconnection and build process as we go along the way. So I hope that helps a little bit, and thank you for letting me share this with you.
All right, thanks very much, Kirk. Quick question on that. On the maps, and those look really useful. I've seen similar, I think Con Ed in New York had years ago, a similar map where you could put certain kinds of distributed resources and where they needed to upgrade, equipment in order to be able to accommodate those resources. And on that map, they also had dates. I think this was a result of some docket or some case that occurred. So they had agreed to do upgrades, and then they had dates as to, well, we're going to upgrade this one by such and such a date, that affects this area, and we're going to upgrade that one by this other date, which implies some kind of planning. And apparently that's difficult to do for various reasons for utilities, at least for a lot of utilities. Do you have does GMP have a sort of process for addressing those red line areas where it's difficult right now to cite certain kinds of resources and interconnect, or what would be needed to kind of, in some kind of organized and forward-looking way, upgrade the areas that need to be upgraded?
Yeah, so those red areas that we saw on the map indicate problems in the grids or opportunities to upgrade and increase reliability. So I think the first lens that we look at opportunities like that are through increasing resilience in the grid, increasing reliability and stability on the grid. So in our capital planning, those are the goals that we're trying to achieve. The maps the maps are updated as a result of that work, not necessarily from the perspective that we're trying to increase solar capacity, but it's really as a byproduct of those other upgrades for resilience, stability, and reliability. So as we do those capital projects, then we're able to update the maps, and the maps will show whether or not the system has changed for distributed energy resources.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. We're going to go next to Schuyler Matteson of NYSERDA. And this is to get a bit of a state energy agency perspective and take a look at what some of the issues are in New York and possible ways to address those.
Thanks a lot, Todd. Yeah, Schuyler Matteson from NYSERDA. I lead our energy storage deployment programs over here. One of the key things I want to bring today is kind of the statewide perspective, because as a program administrator and part of the planning process here in New York State, we deal with both bulk and what we call retail, which is kind of distribution sited resources. And so we see the full spectrum of projects from small behind the meter installations to utility scale bulk resources. And as you can imagine, each one of these segments has their own kind of issues. And I wanted to walk through at a high level what the issues we see today, so some of the barriers and the outcomes of those barriers, and then end with a few solutions that we've come up with that we're trying to push through in various proceedings and stakeholder working groups. So if we can go to the next slide, I think I just set up the agenda. So we can kind of skip right ahead to the bulk storage issues as we see them today. Some of these will probably seem very familiar. We can just skip to the next slide. But I wanted to bring the perspective, from New York State. We have a single ISO in our state. We are the only state in that ISO. So it's kind of a unique situation. However, the regulatory paradigm here is the same as if you were in a multi-state ISO, where the planning processes, the interconnection process, all that good stuff is beholden to FERC. And is part of a ISO-based tariff mechanism, and the state doesn't necessarily control any piece of that. So on the bulk side, one of the big issues that we've seen is limited information on the point of interconnect. So to even get any information on how and where you want to interconnect a storage project in the bulk system, you have to have some idea about where the interconnection facilities would be, where in the state would be good from an economics perspective. And what the expected outcome of an interconnection study would be. What type of impacts are you going to have on the system, and how much would it cost to interconnect there? Almost all the information I just listed is information that is behind some form of password protection or paywall. And so it's very difficult and expensive to figure out where you would want to place a bulk storage asset. So what we see is, a lot of uncertainty in this process. Sometimes we even see developers putting multiple projects in the queue at different points of interconnection, so they can run interconnection studies in parallel without wasting time with, going one site at a time, following a 6 month to a year process, figuring out it's too expensive, starting over somewhere else. That's just not good business for someone who's trying to, make money operating storage projects in the state. And so when we try to run these projects in series, unfortunately, it results in basically twice as many projects in the queues. And the way our ISO runs the queue process basically, batches projects in class year processes, staggers projects in the interconnection queue, whoever's first gets their study first. So we're basically just doubling the amount of time to get through every project, resulting in very long timeframes, clogged queues, really high risk of projects failing, and in many cases, projects are entered into the queue expecting to fail, because like I said, some developers are putting in multiple projects just to figure out one that might work. And when you're doubling the amount of studies you're paying for, doubling the amount of time, that results in very high interconnection costs and very high development costs, just because there's very limited information about where you could actually even cite anything. Another issue that we've seen is the material modification rules we have in New York State at the ISO level, where the NYSO considers storage a separate generation source, which means any existing facility that wants to either repower to storage or add storage to utilize its existing headroom has to basically start over through an interconnection process, pay for a whole interconnection process, a whole interconnection study, if they want to add or repower with storage, which, as you can imagine, for a facility who just wants to plop a very space efficient resource on there to utilize their existing headroom that they have in the market, to then have to pay, wait 2 years and pay hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for interconnection studies, most of the time that kills projects before they even start. And is one of the key reasons why the peaker plants downstate have not been able to repower to storage, because they're already sitting on capacity rights, interconnection, and they just want to maybe transfer to storage. But if they're going to have all these extra development fees to transition to storage, they're going to wait as long as they have to do that. So a lot of times this kills projects before they start and adds extra time and cost if we do end up trying to repurpose these sites. A third issue we have is what I term the double study issue, where a lot of utilities and the NYSO are still operating under this very kind of single hour, worst case scenario storage interconnection study process, where storage is studied as a load once, going through assuming it's fully charging at peak times to see what the interconnection cost would be, and then doing another separate study to figure out what would happen if the storage is acting as a generator, injecting its full amount at the low load times, basically breaking the grid in 2 different ways during 2 different times that would never actually happen in reality, 2 separate study timeframes going through that whole process, and then adding those 2 interconnection costs together to determine their actual interconnection costs for that one project. Obviously, the result is extremely high interconnection costs. If you add, say, a 100 megawatt battery charging on peak, obviously there's going to be some system impacts there. But the other issue is when you're running these 2 separate interconnection studies, a lot of time the ISO will do them in series. And so it basically doubles the amount of time storage interconnection study takes. And then once you get to the end and you realize you have these really unrealistic operational assumptions, very high interconnected costs, only after you get your first study are you able to negotiate with the ISO for what those actual new, more realistic assumptions should be, and what your interconnection study should actually say in order to mitigate those high costs. Next slide, please. So all of this added up basically results in number 5 here, long wait times. On top of all the double study issues, once you get through your first interconnection study and you can enter into the class year, you actually have to wait for a class year process to actually happen. The class year process is the method that the ISO uses to batch all the projects who are ready together and do a single interconnection study for everybody, and then aggregate all the interconnection costs and then spread them proportionally out to the projects that are interconnecting during that one batch of projects. Unfortunately, this class year process takes about 2-ish years. And so if you happen to be going through your first interconnection study to try to get in the class year, you miss the cutoff deadline by a month or two, you'll be sitting for 2 years waiting for the next class year to come around. And then once you get in the class year, it takes 2 years to get to the end. So this very, very time-consuming process to get to this class year is then met with another time-consuming process. And this whole time, these bulk projects are paying financing costs, land costs, permitting costs. I've even had many projects that we've supported have to do multiple different sequences of environmental permitting because their 3 or 5 year permit actually runs out because the interconnection process took so long. So this adds financing and development risk as well, because as you have gotten financing, you did it based on whatever prevailing assumptions were there, estimated revenue in the market. If you miss a deadline by 1, 2, 3 years now, because the process takes so long, a lot of your assumptions that went into financing are no longer valid. So it adds a lot of that extra risk and cost. And then at the end of the class year, we get to number 6 here. The NYSO comes up with their batch of interconnection costs that the whole grid will need to interconnect all the projects that are there. They've done their best to try to, allocate those total interconnection costs to the projects that are in the class year. They have what's called a decision period at the end, where they have this batch of costs. They've told everyone what they should pay, and you have to say yes or they kick you out. If somebody says no and gets kicked out, the NYSO has to redo the costs, reallocate the costs, ask you to accept them again. And if anybody says no, they get kicked out, you start it all over again. In most class years recently, we've seen 3, 4, 5 decision periods, each of 30 to 60 days, where you have certain projects getting very high interconnection costs, dropping out, then everybody else has to wait another 30 to 60 days to figure out what their new interconnection costs are. Because once again, since they do batch studies, everybody in the class year's interconnection costs is influenced by whoever else is in the class year. So if one person drops out, they may have had very high interconnection costs that you were helping to bear, and your costs might go up or go down. It's this kind of a free-for-all here, which makes interconnection costs extremely uncertain and dependent on who is in the class year with you and who is in front of you in the queue. So this results in extremely high risk and uncertainty. And we've seen kind of unprecedented levels of attrition and failure of projects in the ISO because of these processes. One data point from the last 2 class year processes that have been led, we've had about 60% of projects drop out after they already paid for the full, double study, got into a class year, got their permits, paid for their down payment, went through a 2-year process. After all of that, we're still seeing about 60% of projects fail. And that's unbelievable. That's a tremendous amount of development costs just being kind of flushed down the toilet in New York State, unfortunately. So we're trying to update that process so they have developers have much better information much earlier in the process. There's a lot less of this kind of Wild West standoff at the end that delays everything and increases risk to projects. But as you can see, there's a bunch of issues that we're dealing with bulk storage, but now I want to kind of switch to the other segments that we have that are a completely different style of development, but also comes with some of their own project development issues for interconnection. So if we could switch to the next slide, I'll talk about the retail side of things. In New York State, our retail sizing, we have a standard interconnection process that maxes out at 5 megawatts. So if you're under 5 megawatts, you can go through the standard interconnection. You can operate through our value of DER tariff in New York State. And there's a completely different regulatory regime here where the Public Service Commission works with the utilities to develop interconnection processes and regulations, and that's what you follow. So in many ways, that's streamlined a lot of stuff as compared to the bulk side. We have a lot different process on the retail side, but this still runs into a lot of issues. Same as with the bulk side, there's historically been limited interconnection information, which results in some of the same issues, like lots of projects being put in at lots of different points of interconnection just to find one that might work. But what we do have on the distribution network is hosting capacity maps. And this might be what Todd was mentioning earlier, that Con Edison and many other utilities in the state have published hosting capacity maps that show what the headroom is at different lines and substations. We even have some more storage specific information such as not just what headroom is there, but what off-peak charging headroom is available to charge the storage, because that's also important. So we've gotten a lot better information. So this is a smaller issue than at the wholesale network, but it's still always that information asynchronicity with the utilities has always been an issue. We still have this kind of double study time frame. The utilities still like to look at worst case scenario, because technically many of these projects are still uncontrolled, and they're non-dispatchable in terms of utility ownership or utility operation. And so if they're out of the utility's hands, the utility wants to make sure they have a good sense about what the worst case scenario is here. So they are still doing kind of two studies, one worst case scenario charging, one worst case scenario discharging, still results in extra time and cost. Third issue here for retail storage is the idea that you heard Chirag talk about earlier, with cost causative rates versus the actual operation in reality. So we have tariffs in New York State to represent demand charges and as used daily demand and peak periods and off peak periods, which are supposed to be based off of the time periods during the day where it costs the most to deliver energy or to operate the grid. And those hours are supposed to be fixed. We're supposed to be sending signals like, if you charge during these hours of the day, it's going to be very expensive. If you charge during these hours, it should be much less expensive. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a lot of these interconnection studies for energy storage are coming back with charging restrictions and discharging restrictions that don't actually align with the same utility's tariff for on-peak and off-peak. So we'll have a utility study come back and say you can only charge this asset between midnight and 8 a.m., but their off-peak window for their charging demand charges in their tariff is like 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And so the interconnection agreement is basically forcing them to charge during hours where they're going to be hit with higher demand charges, even though the higher demand charges are supposed to represent times you don't want them to charge. So there's this conflict between real-time operational data that the utility has about usage on their systems versus historical rates. And when they don't align, you end up having this really high cost burden borne by the developers, where they now have risk in higher costs for charging. They have risk in lost revenue because they're going to be discharging outside of the better hours. And so that's just a really big issue that we are trying to resolve through what we're calling the Appendix K process that we'll get through on the next slide. And then fourth, for retail storage, sorry, can we go back one slide? My mistake. For number 4 here, the last one for retail storage is that we still have energy storage in New York State today is still being charged demand charges for injecting power at peak times. This is a historical anomaly based on the fact that storage has historically been designated a standby energy resource. And this goes back to like the 1970s and large industrials trying to have DERs at their site to mitigate their utility rate charges. Doesn't really fit great, but this is what our Public Service Commission has said, this is the rate structure storage should be on. Part of that rate structure charges energy storage $5, $6, $7 per kilowatt month just to inject power during the peak times when we desperately want them to do it. And in many cases, that buyback demand charge, as it's called, is as expensive as the value we're paying them for the peak power, which makes absolutely no sense. Fortunately, we've done a bunch of studies to prove this fact, to show what the actual cost causative rates would be. We've proposed new rates through the utilities, and we're just waiting on the commission to act and adopt those new rates, which should erase that issue. But we still have the issue where storage is being charged demand charges on its charging off peak as well, even though it's happening at a time when there's very low energy usage and is just shifting power. So we're still dealing with kind of demand charges as an issue, trying to redo rates in general, but we've solved a lot of this issue. We're just waiting on some commission to adopt some new rates. So if we go to the next slide, I know I just threw out a whole bunch of issues that makes it sound like we're literally never going to install any storage in the state. But on the contrary, we've worked very closely with developers and utilities and the ISO to try to figure out some solutions to these issues over the last few years to try to overcome these barriers, because they're adding a lot of cost to the projects that do end up succeeding, but they're also killing a lot of good projects before they can even get to the chance to compete in the markets. So just going one by one after what we listed on the previous slides, for the limited interconnection information, we've been enhancing these existing hosting capacity maps on the distribution network now for 3 to 5 years. They've been extremely helpful in helping to site solar and storage on the distribution network. We're proposing to do a similar thing through the ISO. Once again, we can't force them to do it, but we're pushing them to try to give more detail to folks about, on the transmission system, where are there good interconnection points? Where are there, lower cost interconnections and kind of higher value locations for these resources where they can use existing headroom? That would be a tremendous value to folks in the state. And we're kind of getting some of this for renewables, but we need a different set of information to be valuable for storage. On the material modification issue, I think the easiest thing to do here is just eliminate that. That is, saying that energy storage is a material modification of your site and making it go through its own interconnection process just to add some storage to an existing site is very difficult, very expensive, and most other ISOs, and in fact, I don't know if any other ISOs require this, but this would really eliminate the need to restart the interconnection process and could allow a lot of storage to be installed very quickly at existing sites that might have somewhere between 20 and 100 megawatts of existing headroom. It would also allow those sites to utilize cleaner energy under startup and short dispatch situations, so that we might not have to ramp up some of the fossil fuel generators that are sharing those interconnection points. In terms of the double study issue, where we're kind of doing static single hour worst case scenarios for off peak and then the worst case scenario for on peak, what we've really been pushing for is a more realistic view of doing a single kind of bounded realistic 8760 like hourly modeling study to see what an actual storage project would actually do at these sites and figure out how that impacts the system, and then build a flexible interconnection agreement around that study so that you can really, really lower interconnection costs, and just like say you'll charge people if they end up breaking this interconnection agreement, but your base level interconnection upgrades are not going to be based on this very unrealistic operational profile. In terms of long wait times, we're already working through a lot of changes at the ISO to change this, 2-year batch structure that, adds all this extra risk and uncertainty and cost sharing and all this type of stuff, so that there's better information earlier in the process. And that paired with the limited interconnection information, if we can solve that, we have fewer projects in the queue that are all better projects. You break them into smaller batches, so there's less uncertainty. You share fewer interconnection resources, so that when people are much less likely to drop out, so we're less likely to extend the process and kill projects. So I think this will be a huge change that we're hoping to make over the next year or two, if the NYSERDA is able to get that through their stakeholder process. But we also need the ISO to probably add new resources. So that's just more supercomputers, more people operating these models. We've had the interconnection queues go from somewhere around 5,000 megawatts of generation proposed in New York State like 5 or 6 years ago to now 100,000 megawatts in the queue. So we had a 20x scaling in the queue, and I can promise you the NYSO's staffing did not go up by 20 times. They may have added 1, maybe 2 people to their staff, and we need a dramatic resource restructuring everywhere to try to deal with all of this, these new resource being proposed. And then simplifying the studies, as we've said before, if we can do a single study that's based on reality for all these resources, it makes the wait times a lot shorter. In terms of this cost allocation stare down, it's very related to that changing of the batch structure. If you have smaller batches, it means that there's fewer people that can say no during any given cycle, and you have fewer decision periods, which lowers the uncertainty and lowers the amount of time that you're in an interconnection process. So that would just be better for everybody. In terms of the cost causative rate structure versus the new operational data showing that the usage on the system is having different impacts than their tariff is saying, we just need to update those tariffs to agree with the current system data. If Con Edison thinks all storage should charge between midnight and 8 a.m., then their off-peak time should be midnight to 8 a.m. It shouldn't be some different time that doesn't align with their actual system data. And then finally, we have this exemption for the allocated cost of service demand charges, trying to get resources exempted from injection demand charges, and trying to incorporate new rates that properly incentivize on-peak versus off-peak behavior in charging and discharging. If we go to one final slide here, I wanted to highlight one thing explicitly that we've done in New York State through the retail side, the interconnection processes that the state helps control. We have a lot more power over that section of the interconnection process. And what we've been able to do through the standard interconnection is add what we call the Appendix K process to the interconnection process, where we allow the energy storage project to submit an operational profile and charge discharge cycles, any constraints they want to put on the interconnection study through this question N under Appendix K, submit that information to the utility to help inform the utility's dispatch study for the energy storage system. So instead of the utility just doing these single peak hour, assuming storage charges during the worst time and discharges during the worst time and add those two things together, the storage developer can submit this form to say, we promise not to charge at your peak hour. We're not going to charge at any time that increases the utility system peak demand. So make sure you're not studying us like that. The utility might still do their own study about that worst case scenario just for their information, but they will at least take this developer response as a scenario, and that can dramatically reduce the interconnection costs. So that's something we've been able to do here, but I think I've been over time, so I can stop now and we can get to questions.
Great, thank you very much, Schuyler. Let's get everybody to turn their webcams back on. We have a few minutes, we have a lot of questions, so let's try to get really concise answers, a sentence or two if you possibly can. Yeah, Schuyler, I want to follow up on that. Is that working, that Schedule K? Is it, risk is easier to perceive sometimes than to assuage. How do you convince a utility that somebody just signing a piece of paper is going to be sufficient to prevent any kind of grid instability issues down the line?
Right. So there's a few ways we see this done. You can either implement software controls of the interconnection so you can't do what you say you're not going to do. You can build it into the interconnection agreement, and maybe there's no software controls, but you'll have some really high fee that you have to pay if you actually do break your interconnection agreement and charge during peak hours. There's a number of things you can do to actually control that, but the important thing is to try to do a realistic study up front, charge them for only the interconnection upgrades that they definitely think they're going to use, and then build in some agreement with the utility that they're not going to break the system, and if they do, they pay for it.
Great. Tony, we had a few people wondering why, if it's so difficult, you couldn't just, use your solar and your battery resources for your own facility needs and forget about the interconnection. And, there's a general answer to that, but is there a specific answer that you want to?
Well,
obviously the system was planned a certain way for certain applications, but.
So if you're talking about separating the battery and the solar from the grid connected power and somehow using it separately at the site, that is not possible out there. Our base load is 300 kilowatts overnight just sitting there. And so you have to always have that going. We have to be connected to the grid to do that. And it's not practical, or I don't even know how you would approach separating completely. So I think it's because of the fact that we're not offsetting the entire load, that we have to connect into the grid to make it happen.
Yeah, and just to clarify for people, you can design a solar and storage system to be operational behind the meter that does not connect to the grid and just islands all the time and just supplies a facility. But most of these systems, as far as I am aware, economically need to connect to the grid for various reasons. You're trying to get a payback, and it's hard to get a payback just from supplying your own, unless you're completely off grid, you're in some remote island situation, and that's how you're going to get your power. But for most of these situations, people are trying to do various things to make back the money that they've invested on these systems. And so a lot of those things have to do with providing services to the grid, and so you have to have that connection. Okay, the procedures in New York State ISO. We have several people asking, are those common with all ISOs? Are the other ISOs doing similar kinds of things? And are there ways to work around it or efforts to change it?
There is not a way around it. There are massive efforts to change it. Unfortunately, it's out of our hands, even as the state entities. It's out of our hands. It's a FERC jurisdictional process to update those systems. But to answer your question, for the most part, no. A lot of these things don't really happen in other ISO territories. A lot of the other ISOs treat energy storage, as a non-firm load. So if you can't, if the utility or the ISO doesn't want you to charge during a certain time, they don't have to sell you the energy. If the storage is trying to participate in the market, they can just say no to your bid. The NYSO has reserved that right as well to just say no to your bid, but they're also charging you as if they didn't have that power, just to be doubly sure in the process. So no, this doesn't happen in Texas. This doesn't happen in California. The material modification process is not in Texas or California. The double study is not anywhere else. This is all just kind of some really old, ultra conservative processes in our ISO, unfortunately.
I imagine there may be odd processes in other ISOs as well, which would be an interesting thing to look at. Okay, somebody is asking whether there is a recommendation from any of the speakers for Connecticut about which group should serve as the advanced organization for dealing with interconnection problems. For example, they say the Public Utility Regulatory Authority, or PURA in Connecticut. I'm going to put that out there, but I just want to say that probably any solution to most of these problems at the state level is going to have to involve the utility regulatory agency, whatever that is in that state. I do want to mention in Massachusetts, there is a newly formed advisory committee. I think it's called the Grid Modernization Advisory Committee, and there's also subcommittees on interconnection issues. So, you could have some kind of group of stakeholders from different, from the utility, from the development community, from state energy agencies and others, they could work together and make recommendations to, the regulator. The regulators are going to be the ones that I think have to sign off on this in the end if there's going to be changes to these processes, but maybe I'm missing something. Does anybody want to chime in on this?
No, I think that's right. To a certain extent, if you're talking about bulk storage, you're going to be in an ISO. I think, ISO New England over there, in New York, it's New York State ISO. But if you're trying to, deal with lower voltage or smaller interconnections, you have to go through the regulator. They're the ones that would be controlling the interconnection process through the utilities.
Yeah, which brings up a good question, Chirag, for you and Sachin. From looking at the problem both at the state level and also the regional level, ISO and RTO, and then nationally, what elements of this are things that can be addressed locally? I mean, FERC, you can't, a state can't really do much to influence a FERC decision, but maybe not even an ISO decision. But which of these problems can be attacked at the state level with state agencies and stakeholders?
Yeah, so I mean, I think take Massachusetts, for example. Massachusetts does have the ability to create a structure to finance and facilitate distribution system upgrades on the territories within Massachusetts, right? You take like Eversource's like service territory within Massachusetts, for instance, right? That kind of thing, the Massachusetts government can set up particular processes. As it relates to specific towns, unfortunately, I think they are kind of at the mercy of these state level working groups and processes, kind of by nature, because these span huge regions of the state. But yeah, I would not, I would, to the extent that you could convince these Massachusetts working groups to work faster on getting these processes aligned and trying to change cost causation for state level processes, you should. And I don't think those have to necessarily wait for FERC, for example.
Okay. We're going to need to wrap this up. I apologize to those who stuck with us and asked questions that we didn't get to. I know we didn't get to a lot, and I apologize for that. We had a lot of speakers. Feel free to contact us. I think we have a contact information slide somewhere that we can put up with questions, follow-up questions, or requests for information. I'll do my best to get those to the proper people. And you can download the recorded webinar from CISA's webinar archive. Samantha, do you have any upcoming, and thank you to our speakers. It was an excellent presentation. Samantha, any upcoming events you want to mention?
Yes, there are 2 listed on the screen right now, happening in the first week of June, and I think they will be very interesting. So you can register for those on our website, cisa.org/webinars.
Okay, thanks much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks.